Madoff pleads guilty and goes to jail. He swindled $65 billion and never invested a penny. But the big question remains, what happened to all the money? It may be even worse than we think. Is life in prison payback enough for the con artist of the century? Plus, does Octomom finally get it that she needs help with all 14 of her children? Then, Rihanna latest. Tyra and Oprah join forces to fight dating violence. Their must-see message right now on Larry King Live. Good evening. I'm Judge Janine Pirro sitting in for Larry. Let's get started with Bernard Madoff, an admitted crook. He said in court today that he was sorry and ashamed, and then the judge threw him in jail while his victims applauded. We're joined tonight by Mark Seal, contributing editor of Vanity Fair. He wrote Madoff's World, which is in the current Vanity Fair issue. Dr. Michael Wellner, a forensic psychiatrist, and David Kelly, former United States attorney and now an attorney who represents entities victimized by Madoff. And with us also is Joanna Chung. She's with the Financial Times and was in the courtroom today. Joanna, I'm going to start with you. You were in the courtroom. You were there when Madoff walked in, when he gave his plea allocution. What was it like in the courtroom, and how did he react as he spoke to the court?
It was quite dramatic. There was lots of emotion. He actually read from a piece of paper to describe what he did to the judge as he pled guilty. And, you know, you can tell everyone was leading in to hear what he would say. I think that a few of the investors, you know, were quite emotional when the judge said that he was going to send Mr. Madoff directly to jail. There was some applause, and also there were some tears.
Well, Joanna, some of those people had the opportunity to speak to the court. Is that correct?
That's correct. There were three people who addressed the court. The first person, actually, a gentleman, when he went up to the podium, he actually took a step towards Mr. Madoff and demanded that Mr. Madoff look at him and address his victims, at which point the judge said, you know, go back to the podium and finish speaking. And that was the only time, actually, that Mr. Madoff turned away from staring straight ahead and took a quick look. But you know, most of the time he was staring straight ahead, and he did not show much emotion. He was quite fidgety, but he did not show much emotion. He
used the word sorry and remorseful. Did he appear to be that in terms of his emotion, in terms of how he presented himself to the court, or was he just reading?
He was just reading. He was a bit nervous, I felt, because he did fumble over some of the words even as he read from the piece of paper. And aside from the time that he was reading his allocution, he was quite fidgety. When he was sitting there, he adjusted his tie quite a bit. He touched his face and hair quite a bit. You know, he kept drinking from water. He adjusted his papers. But most of the time, he was quite impassive, just staring straight ahead.
Okay. All right, Joanna, thank you. I'm going to go to David Kelly. David, you're the former United States Attorney for the Southern District, which is the district that has prosecuted Madoff. 11 counts. He pled guilty as charged to those 11 counts. How did the U.S. Attorney arrive at those particular 11 counts?
Well, I think what they did was to take each count that they could to apply to different segments of the offense. They kind of parsed through his conduct and looked to see which statutes applied to that, trying to get as much exposure, statutory exposure for a penalty as they could. So they looked at the money laundering aspect, they looked at the mail fraud aspect, they looked at the false statements to the SEC, they looked at the perjury, and with each element or each part of his conduct, they applied a different criminal statute. So
essentially he faces 150 years in prison. I mean, he will clearly die behind bars. What do you think the sentence will ultimately be?
It's going to be probably about 150 years. I mean, I don't think the judge is really going to look at the actuarial chart. They're going to look at the statutes and the guidelines, and in this case, you have the sentencing guidelines, but the statutory exposure goes well beyond that, and that's what he's going to get.
Okay. All right. And Mark Seal, contributing editor, you, right after the arrest on December 11th, went out and started doing an in-depth article on Bernard Madoff. Tell us about this guy. What is his deal?
Well, you know, I concentrated on the victims across America. I interviewed 40 victims, and each Each person was worse than the next. You would open the door and there'd be varying scenes of devastation. People were screaming, crying, cursing, plotting revenge. These are people that will never get to see him as they did today in the courtroom. And everybody was saying, who is this man? Is he a Jekyll and Hyde? Is he one person one way and the next another? I mean, nobody could figure it out in the beginning.
Tell us.
Well, I think, you know, as the man in London who knew him very well said, he's a Jekyll and Hyde. He said, I know Bernie Madoff very well for 30 years, but the man who is being led away in handcuffs, nobody seems to know.
Well, what's interesting, though, also, is that you considered investing with him.
Well, I did. At first, I didn't have enough money to invest with him mainly, but also he worked on the power of no, you know, the most seductive power. Right. If you can't get into something, a restaurant, a club, an investment opportunity, you want to get into it all the more. So I think that was the seduction. And,
you know, when you talk about, you know, the fact that so many people are devastated, and I'll go to you, Dr. Wellner, you know, are we dealing with evil here? This man pulled off the biggest fraud, not just on Wall Street, but in American history. He was a respected member of the community. He attracted celebrities and famous people. How did he do this?
Well, you know, that's a complicated question, because if the market doesn't crash, then Bernie Madoff has got a lot of happy investors who are still working with him, and that was the secret. He kept everybody happy. And so he didn't have disgruntled investors, and the secret was the word of mouth. And what many people misinterpret about this situation is that, like other Ponzi schemes, people were exploited for their greed. No, it worked because Bernie Madoff was trading safety, much the way a televangelist or a priest offers people salvation and in a corrupt way takes advantage. He offered them safety and security, and people invested thinking that they were not taking risk, and this is why it is so especially traumatic for them.
Okay, all right. Well, we're going to come back in a moment to continue talking about this. As some of Larry's viewers may already be aware, Larry, too, was one of the many people who lost money while investing with Bernard Madoff. Luckily, his loss was not significant. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking about Bernard Madoff and what the attraction was to so many investors who tried so hard to become clients of his. And maybe, you know, Mark Seal, who has done an incredibly in-depth article on Madoff for Vanity Fair magazine. Why, Mark, did people trust him? I mean, these are not just ordinary people. I mean, these are like, you know, titans and masters of the universe.
Exactly. It's a herd mentality. When you see people who are richer, smarter, more successful than you are, you want to be with them. You kind of trust their judgment, you know, and so that's what happened in this case. Bernie had two men he was a surrogate son to these two wildly successful men who started him in business, who considered him a son, and with these two men's blessings, just these two people saw, wow, I want to be with him. Look how rich he made them.
It was almost as though he was anointed.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. And Dr. Wellner, I mean, you talk about an analogy to organized crime, to a family. We're not suggesting that this was organized crime, but tell us about that.
Oh, I'm suggesting that it's organized crime.
Oh,
I think that what distinguishes this is that you have a business which was closely held, closely protected, evidence being destroyed, someone who positioned himself very close to regulators who would otherwise be in a position to provide oversight, and that's the way organized crime runs. It's the appearance of legitimacy. It's not the guns and the shoot 'em up. It's the appearance of a legitimate, low-key businessman with unspeakable scale of corruption.
Okay, David, let me ask you. I mean, you've done many RICO cases as the United States Attorney. You know racketeering. No RICO here, no racketeering, no conspiracy, which allowed him to allocute in court and not identify anyone else.
And you know why? They kept it simple. and they kept it simple, but at the same time got him 150 years of coverage. So why bring in all those elements that just complicate things? Now, on the conspiracy charge, they didn't bring it in, number one, because they may have not completed their investigation, number one, but number two, he may not have wanted, and reports are that he didn't want to plead to a conspiracy charge because he didn't want to implicate others. They didn't need to do it here.
Well, they didn't need to do it, but you see, you represent entities, and there are thousands of people who want money. This indictment is not the end. We've got Ruth Madoff, who's got $68 million apparently, who was moving money at very significant times in the investigation. His brother is a chief compliance officer. His sons are part of the organization. And
the old man falls on his sword and takes the fall for the rest of the family, and that's a very patrician thing to do, even in organized crime.
But they're not going to let that happen, are they, David?
They're not going to let that happen. And, look, this is a Big Bang Theory of cases. This walked in the door back in December. And the fact that they charged him now, that happened very quickly, without cooperation. Right. The fact, typically a case of this scope would take us so long to investigate. They've got a lot of work to do. This is just the tip of the iceberg, I think, and they have an awful lot to do to figure out all those questions that you just raised. Who was involved? Who was cooking the books? While he was off in the Riviera and so forth, there had to be someone watching the shop, and they had to know what they were watching.
There's no question, David. They had to create the false documents, the bogus financial statements, hundreds of millions of dollars going through Chase Manhattan Bank. Who's watching the bank? Who's watching the money? He lies and perjures himself at the SEC. No one catches this guy. Why, Mark?
It's Shakespearean. Nobody's it's gonna be so interesting to see how this plays out.
What about the wife? You saw the family.
Yes.
You spoke to people who've known them for decades.
Did
she know? Did Ruth know?
We don't know yet, but they grew up together, they worked together, they had offices side by side with each other. They couldn't have been closer.
Thank you. Now, final question. His life has changed forever today. Bernie Madoff goes to jail. He's now living in a 7.5 by 8 cell. What does he get up to every morning? How does he survive here?
He was detached in crime, and he is detached in confession.
Sociopath?
I don't think we can say that about him. He had a successful family life. He ran a successful social life. Not everybody who commits a crime of large scale is a sociopath, and that's the lesson. Crime doesn't start with sociopathy. It starts with selfishness, and this is a crime of selfishness.
Enormous, enormous selfishness. And so then, to you, it's about evil.
I think that if we were to take a depravity scale look at this, that what distinguishes this crime from other white-collar crimes, besides the scope of it, is that he may well have enlisted people who scammed others without even realizing that they were responsible for liquidating charities and others of their life savings. They never even knew that they were part of a criminal enterprise.
Well, as my mother always said, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And I wonder about those investors. Should they have known? And who were really the victims here? The people who've been invested for years and years and have pretty much gotten their money out already? Or the newest investors who have not seen any interest on the principal? Investors at the end, at the beginning of the Ponzi, they've been paid over and over, David. Do you see the newer ones suing the older ones?
I don't think that can happen at all. I don't think the law or the facts are really going to support that. I think that you are right. There may be people who invested. I think you'll find as this investigation goes forward a closer look at intermediaries, some of the feeder funds or some of the people who are steering investments into this.
Thank you. All right. Thank you to my panel.